I agree with a lot of the things that you're saying, but the overall principle of it all is that you're saying that fighters are stuck there and they can't leave. That's not true. Fighters chose to put themselves in that contract, and they chose to stay there. There's times where fighters could have re-signed or signed with somewhere else in the middle of their contract. Even for more money, they've decided to stay with the UFC. So what does that say? That's an argument.
I definitely agree with a lot of what you're saying, that a lot of the fighters, they get blinded by that UFC, those 3 letters. And I know a guy who's been offered a Bellator contract, and he's going, no, man, I'm holding out for the UFC. And we're like, buddy, you're getting older. It's time for you to just go where you can. But that conversation really doesn't have anything to do with the monopolization of the sport as well. Because if you look at our case, and what the judge has agreed with us on is that the UFC in a bad year makes 94% of every MMA dollar spent around the world. Mm-hmm. And they have 95, 98% of the top fighters. If you go to an independent rankings and look at the top 10 fighters of every single weight class, if the UFC isn't all 10, it's 9 or 8. But they've got it all.
But wouldn't that be on the media though? That's not so much. That's the media. We can't. I can't state court cases against the UFC based on the media. That's the problem.
I'm not sure what you mean by the media. Talking about the rankings.
Yeah, the media is the one that comes up with their own rankings. The UFC doesn't tell them to put that in there. Maybe they do, but I'm simply saying, like, the media should have control of their own rankings. And now, if they choose to listen to the UFC and put them there, that's not on the UFC.
But no, that has nothing to do with my point. My point being is that the UFC has most of the badass talent wrapped up.
Because the fighters choose to be there because of the 3 letters. That's my argument. My argument is that you're saying, they do have 90.
And I'm not disagreeing with you. Okay. I'm not disagreeing with you. But it doesn't mean it's not a monopoly. It's very similar to the Screen Actors Guild. If the best director, if Martin Scorsese put out a Craigslist ad and said, hey, I'm going to shoot this movie, but I'm not going to pay anybody, you'd have actors lined up around the block to be in a Scorsese movie. So the Screen Actors Guild came along and said, we need to protect ourselves from ourselves. We need to set bare minimums to do these things. It is the same thing with other sports, with the NFL, with the Players Association. You'd have guys that would be like, hell yeah, I'll play in the NFL. I don't care about any of that stuff. We need to protect ourselves from ourselves. And it's the advice I always give every fighter. And this, I think, speaks a lot to your point, because they're like, hey, what can you give me? I'm up and coming. Should I train in this or should I train in that? I always say the same thing. Treat it like a business. If you don't, you will be left broke and broken at the end of your career, because everyone around you is. The promoter wants to make as much money as they possibly can. Your coach, who loves you, wants to see you succeed. He has bills. You have to treat it like a business. And to a lot of these fighters that get blinded by the UFC, those 3 letters, I agree with you. The Eddie Alvarez's, though, they are very few and far between. We see Bellator just got really excited about signing Yoel Romero. He lost 4 out of his last 5. Why not when he was a top contender? And we've also seen common knowledge, but also things that we've seen in private emails through our discovery, when there's a fighter who's talking about leaving and we see the email that says tack on a few more months onto their contract. Well, how do I do that? Find a reason.
Yeah.
Offer him some fight with 5 minutes notice, and when he doesn't take it, we can say he's in breach of contract. We see these types of things.
We just talked about the Yair Rodriguez situation going on right now with the USADA ban or giving him a suspension. I said they're not going to let him go during his suspension, and they're going to wait 6 more months because he's on a 6-month suspension. They'll tack that next 6 months on, and then after that they may cut him, or they're going to do what you just said, give him a last minute fight. If you don't take it, then okay, we'll extend it on to you. They're going to hold him up and lie him up. I understand. Yeah, I get what you're saying. That's not a monopoly, though. These fighters can leave in their prime. Well,
that's still a monopoly, because the monopoly doesn't have to do when someone comes or goes. It comes to do with market share. And what the UFC is able to do, they get to dictate the market prices because they make so much of every dollar spent around the world. It's just like with Facebook right now. It's being sued by 48 states and the federal government. Well, why? I could start my own social media company. I have internet. I have a computer. So why can't I do that? Oh, because they have such a massive market share, I would be nothing.
Because you probably don't know how to code.
I could hire somebody to do that.
I'm just kidding, man. I'm giving you a hard time. I don't know how to code, so what the hell?
It really comes down to their ability to dictate the market and the massive amount of fighters that they have, the massive amount of dollars that they make from it, and whether or not fighters continue to buy into that. And I agree 100% with you. As I just said, these fighters have to treat it like a business. Too many of them, they look at it as just Joe Silva told me one time, I wish I could run a tournament for every fight because everyone thinks they can win and you don't have to pay them shit. That's the promoter mindset right there. And that's the fighter's mindset right there. We have to change that. And unfortunately, it's not going to happen too easily. And a promoter's not going to say, you know what, I'm worth a few $1 billion now. I'm good. It's time to really take care of these guys. And that's what happened in boxing with the Ali Act. You had to get it to where a promoter can no longer also be a manager, where a promoter cannot control the rankings of who gets a title fight. A promoter cannot be promoting both sides of a title fight. They can't be managing both sides because you get this corruption. And we've seen it over and over again with guys offered the title shot and they're told, okay, you're going to sign away this, you're going to sign away that, here's your never-ending contract. And they go, well, no, I'm going to step back to the table, I'm going to renegotiate this. And they just go, cool, so you don't get a title shot. And I think John Fitch is the best example of all of this. The number one contender for 6 years, he gets one title fight. And the UFC, if you remember when they sent out you need to sign over your likeness rights to everybody, John Fitch, he didn't refuse the sign. He had questions. Yeah. He said, hey, I'm confused about this in perpetuity and our kids don't get anything. And the UFC said, cool, we're cutting you and we're cutting your entire team unless you bend the knee and do what we tell you to do. And at the time, you talk about fighters choosing their careers, the fighters that got sucked in from Pride, Strikeforce, WEC, Affliction, they didn't get to choose. Now, all of a sudden, they're working for the UFC. And they have their way of doing things in their contract. And for the biggest time, and even now, obviously, the UFC is the big dog throughout the world. You have the Bellators coming up and doing their thing around. They have some legit fighters. But the UFC worldwide is the brand of MMA. They're the ones that control everything as far as it goes. And the easiest way, the best way to get this to change is through our class action lawsuit, where we're not just asking for relief for, yes, we believe our wages have been suppressed. In a free market, we should have gotten more. But that's not just what we're after. We want them to change their restrictive contracts. And then when the Ali Expansion Act comes into play, that's when it's really going to open up. And I have nothing against UFC. I have nothing against Dana White. Dana White helped me when that back surgery I was talking about. I went to him. I said, man, I'm broken. I need some help. He helped me find the surgeon and get the surgery. The UFC paid for my surgery that got me back in. I'm happy for Dana's success. I'm proud to have been a part of the organization. I'm happy for that. But now I want it to be passed on through the Ali Expansion Act, through the class action lawsuit. So the next fighters coming up are going to be looking at literally life-changing money that's going to set up their family and set up their kids. If you look at the NFL, they kind of treat it like, yeah, I'm blowing out my knees and my shoulders. I'm taking all this damage, but that's why I'm paid so much. The worst player in the NFL makes what, $500,000 a year to ride the bench? And it just goes up from there because they have a players association, because they have the free market where they can bid on them in between the teams. That's not going to happen in MMA until Bellator can bid on a fighter that the UFC wants to keep. That's when things are going to start changing. And even if it was just, if every fighter besides the champion was able to just go whenever they wanted to, that's enough to change the game. Because once those champions, if you don't sign away those rights and those likenesses, and first off, you never get a title fight, your last fight on your contract. You have to re-sign to get that title fight. And if you win, they tack on another one. It's the never-ending champions clause. And those things are illegal in boxing. And you'll see Dana White usually once a year come out and say, hey, I'm going to get involved in boxing. This is going to be great. I love this sport. And then 2 weeks later, boxing is so broken, I can't even step in there and fix this. Well, what he means is the Ali Act means that he can't keep 85% of the money, that other people are going to come in and bid for those fights, and he has to be in a competitive wage market. This is purely about capitalism from my perspective. And when we look at, if you want to get into the Ali Act, it was passed with, I think it was 16 signers, more Democrats than Republicans. 4 years ago, when we were heading back to DC with Congressman Mark Wayne Mullen, who was signed with the UFC for a time being, so he knows the world of MMA. We had 58 signers on our bill. We were ready to go to the floor for a vote. We had more Republicans signing than Democrats. And then there was a change in residency at the White House. And President Trump came in, and he's a big supporter by Dana White. And we've seen Donald Trump at the fights throughout the years. We saw Dana going to the White House. All of a sudden, our bill died in committee, never to be heard from again. So once we get this change of administration, we're going to be back in DC. We're going to be pushing the Ali Expansion Act. And like I said at the beginning, how exciting is this for Bellator and all the other organizations and everybody that wants to be a promoter, because they get to jump into the fray and bid on these fights.
All right,
yeah,
Nate,
the UFC.
Nate, I have two questions for you on this, okay? First off, we'll talk a little bit about the Ali Act, because part of what you were talking, the Ali Act came about as far as the management and the promotion because of Don King and Mike Tyson.
Yeah.
Okay. That's where that came. But I want you to think, in MMA, grassroots MMA, many promoters manage fighters because they actually start promotions because they need to get their guys fights. You have guys like Monty Cox, who came up with Extreme Challenge and talking about fighting Mike Whitehead, the guy that he managed and everything. You had all of those times and all of those fighters that he would manage, and he would get fights in his own promotion and then let them go to the UFC. So that's kind of been the history of MMA with grassroots MMA. Promotion and management. The UFC does not manage any fighters. Zero.
Well, and I have a story about Monty Cox, because I fought in Monty Cox's show against Monty Cox's fighter with Monty Cox's referee. And they did everything that they could to make sure I did not beat Drew McFedries. At one point, I had Drew's back. He was at quarters. My ankles were underneath the ropes, and the referee stood us back up because they knew that was Drew's best shot. The way that sports go, it's supposed to be the last bastion of fairness. And if you have a promoter with an invested interest in a fighter, he's going to be paying that fighter more money than the opponent. I remember Dana saying at one point he wanted to hire Mike Dolce to work with Cyborg to get her down to weight so she could take on some fight. And I sat here and I went, are you kidding me? The promoter is blatantly saying he's going to invest in one of the fighters on his card over the other fighter. How immoral is that? Can you imagine that in the NFL if Goodell came out and he said, hey, you know, we want New York in the Super Bowl, so we're going to raise their salary cap by a couple million. But you understand, this is what's best for the sport, and that's what the fans want to see. That's not sports then. That's a show. That's pro wrestling. In an actual competition of sports, the cream rises to the top. So yeah, a promoter also being a manager is illegal in boxing. They can have a manager working very closely with a promoter. Monty Cox could have been running that show, had his buddy there as manager, could have kept getting fights for him. Monty would have done just as well. Maybe he would have been the manager and had his buddy do the promoting. The ways to work around it that aren't illegal and aren't immoral, that still give people their fair shot.
All right, let's talk about what the class action lawsuit actually does. By it being classified as a class action, now it's not just the people that brought it forth. Even guys like Josh, because we're going by a time period of fighters, and it's a little over 1,200 fighters that could actually be brought into this class action lawsuit. But class action lawsuits take a long time. This is going to go on for years. Let's just be honest. And there's going to come a point, because as soon as it becomes a class action, now if it does go to court and the defendant loses, they pay 3 times. That's the standard for a class action lawsuit. So if this is the amount of money that we've determined that they did not pay out, they will pay at least 3 times that, which is, when you're looking, it's going to be somewhere in the billions of dollars. So there's going to come a point within all of this, if this is not going well for the UFC, which normally they've won every lawsuit, every court case that comes about, they get it dismissed. So we'll say that they don't get it dismissed, but they end up coming and going, all right, we want to settle. So they could settle for millions of dollars, giving the fighters, you, Josh, other people, that money that can be split evenly between you. But then there's also going to be what's called a non-disclosure sign saying that no one can talk about it and nothing's going to change. So who's the guy that's in charge of this to the point that you guys say we're never going to settle?
Boy, has anyone said we would never settle?
No, I didn't say you did. But my whole point is there's no way that you can settle and get the things that you want, because in the end, settling will end up being about money, not about the change of the sport.
Well, not necessarily, because we could put into a settlement that we don't want a champions clause anymore. Or maybe you just get 2 fights on the champions clause, or 1 fight, but you get to re-sign. You can put anything into a settlement that would change the sport. And again, I always keep referring back to the Ali Expansion Act, because that will change the sport. But really, if we were to settle with the UFC, you can make that over anything. And
you got to look and say the UFC, and this is not me bashing on the UFC at all. If I'm part of the UFC, I'm not going to settle for something that now I have to rewrite every contract I have. Why would I put that in a settlement?
That's true. But if you can see the writing on the wall coming down with the Ali Expansion Act, much better to get ahead of it. And I won't kid you, there are a lot of guys out there that are upset at the UFC, that are not happy with the way that they've been treated.
You don't say.
From my perspective, I want the UFC to stay top dog in the world. And all it's going to mean is they have to competitively bid on all the fights. And they're positioned such to do so. They could outbid everyone for every single fight and maintain on top. And you'd see the pay of the fighters go through the roof. But if it did come down to a settlement, then we would have to decide on what we think is a reasonable amount of damages for the wrongdoing that we allege has happened throughout those years. I do want to make a point, though, that our lawsuit, due to the statute of limitations, starts in December of 2010, goes through 2017. My last fight was in the spring of 2010. I'm no longer in the lawsuit. The identity class was not granted certification, just the bout class, just the fighters.
Yep.
So maybe at some point I will get some compensation. I won't say that I won't. But when I originally sat down and thought about this, I asked 2 questions, because a lesson I learned a long time ago, and when somebody in business told me, in every business deal you go through, tell yourself their job is to make money. Your job is to not be stupid. Find out where they're making money. So I sat down with the team of lawyers and I said, cool, so what's in it for you? What's in it for me? What's in it for everybody else? And the lawyers, they deserve to be compensated for their time. And they told me, well, you may get a portion of the class action suit as well if it gets that far. But due to the statute of limitations, you may not even be in the bout class. We'll try to get the identity. That might not fly. And so I sat there and I had to come to terms with, why am I doing this? Am I doing this to get myself richer, or am I doing this because I believe it's the right thing to do? Because I think that it will change the sport for those fighting now, for those fighting during that time period that I think we're taking advantage of, but especially for the next generation of fighters.
100% agree.